We're going to go ahead and get started. And good afternoon to everybody. I'm Andy Rich. I'm the Dean of the Colin Powell School, which is the School of Social Sciences here at City College. And I want to welcome you to a conversation about stories of social mobility in America, a discussion with Paul Solman, the economics correspondent for the PBS NewsHour, and moderated by Bob McKinnon, director of the Moving Up Media Lab and an instructor in our economics and business department. This is an event whose origins trace in two directions. Most immediately, it came from the suggestion of Chris Lee, a colleague in the Division of Science, who said to me, hey, I know Paul Solman, and he might be open to speaking at City College. I watch the PBS NewsHour every night religiously. So for me, this was incredibly exciting news, and it set things in motion quickly for today's event. Second, the event and its actual focus came from a much longer set of conversations with Bob McKinnon, our real host today, who for several years has been thinking about social mobility and about how higher education is crucial as a variable for social mobility, but how social mobility generally can be achieved in this country. And he's in fact teaching a course on this subject this semester. And the students from that class are joining us today, or actually in some ways, I think we're joining them. CCNY is at the forefront of colleges and universities for achieving social mobility for our students. Our graduates end up in a dramatically better place on average economically than where they started. And that's a big deal, especially when you realize that more than 70% of the students are the first in their families to go to college. CCNY is an extraordinarily diverse place too. More than half of our students are immigrants, 80% are people of color. So when our students succeed, when they have the experience of social mobility, it changes the trajectory of life for themselves and their families, and it also changes our society. And so today we come together to understand this phenomenon better. It's not abstract, it's not just academic, it's a real issue that is fundamental to the City College experience. And I'm grateful to have all of you with us, both the students of Professor McKinnon and others from our community and beyond. So let me just introduce our two speakers more fully. Paul Solman is host of Making Sense, and he has been a business, economics, and an occasional art correspondent for the PBS NewsHour since 1985. Paul has lectured on college campuses since the 1980s and has written for a number of publications, including the Journal of Economic Education. He thinks he's the only person besides John Kenneth Galbraith to have written for both Forbes and Mother Jones magazines. He was for years the East Coast editor of the latter. A one-time cab driver, kindergarten teacher, craft store co-owner, and management consultant, he is also the author and presenter of Discovering Economics with Paul Solman, a series of videos to accompany introductory economics textbooks. 2007, he joined the faculty at Yale, where he added a dose of communications know-how and economics to the university's grand strategy course for a decade. In 2011, he was the Richmond Distinguished Visiting Professor at his alma mater, Brandeis, where he taught a seminar, Economic Grand Strategies, from Chimps to Champs or Chumps. And he's lectured at campuses across the country, regularly at West Point and at Gateway Community College in New Haven, Connecticut. 2016, he was a visiting fellow at Mansfield College, Oxford University, and he's also the president of the new Making Friends Across the Political Divide group, US.
It's now called the American Exchange Project.
Ah, excellent. American Exchange.
And I'll explain, yeah.
Okay. Bob McKinnon is an instructor in the Colin Powell School's Department of Economic and Business. He is the son of Daytona Roth, a former bartender who raised 3 children, largely by herself, in various row houses in Chelsea, Massachusetts, and trailers in rural Pennsylvania. He is a proud former recipient of food stamps, welfare, Medicaid, Pell Grants, student loans, and numerous other government benefits. His educational and professional success would not be possible without the kindness and efforts of countless teachers, mentors, social workers, friends, family, nonprofit workers, and individuals, many of whom will never know their impact on his life. Among others, the Institute of Medicine, the National Institute of Health, the Federal Trade Commission, the National Governors Association, and US Congress have called upon Bob to provide honest perspective on the many issues facing us today. He is a contributor to the Huffington Post, a frequent lecturer, and he's appeared on NPR's All Things Considered, as well as been interviewed by the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. It is wonderful to have Paul and Bob with us today. I want to turn it over to Bob for today's discussion. A couple of last notes. Just as we were having all of you join us, Paul asked that we strongly encourage folks to turn on their cameras. And so if you're in a place where you can, we really would love to see you. We know that in some instances you might not be able to, but it makes the whole experience more lively. So if you can turn on your camera, please do. We would love to see you. I also want to let you know we are recording the conversation for those who can't be with us right now, and it'll actually be for a podcast too. Then I want to let you know that Bob is going to be taking questions from the chat when we get to the Q&A for today's event. So please, throughout today's event, feel free to share your thoughts and your questions in the chat, and we will pick them up there. And then last, I just want to mention that we have muted everybody. So we'll use the chat as our way to communicate with everybody. And with that, let me turn it over to Bob.
Great. Thank you, Andy, for the introduction. Thank you, Paul, for joining us tonight. And thanks for everyone to take the time out of their busy schedules as we approach dinner time on a Monday when we know there's so much going on in the world. So thank you for your time and your attention. So Paul, I wanted to start with, obviously so much of your reporting is on the issue of social mobility. It's often grounded in very personal stories.
Yep.
People whose life experiences are, central to what you're reporting on. And I was wondering if you could sort of just ground everyone in your own story, a minute or two about how you got to where you are. The note about being a taxi driver might be of interest to those of us in New York, but we'd love to just hear about how you got to where you are today in a minute or two.
In a minute or two, I don't know. My father taught at City, CCNY when it was City College. He was an artist, painter, who fine artist, who sold his work and was in galleries and it's in museums and stuff. But he worked before he took the job at City in 63 for 20 years almost. After the war, he worked 5 months a year as a pari-mutuel clerk at the racetracks of New York when it was warm enough for the thoroughbred horses to run. So my background is both, left wing. My parents were both, I think, members of the Communist Party. I know my mother was, although you didn't talk about it in those days because of the McCarthyism. And I know there was some guy who was, I think, on the lam who was harbored in our apartment one night, but nobody talked about it. My sister and I just sort of figured it out. So it was a left wing background but there was no distinction between being an artist and being a pari-mutuel clerk. That is the person who punches the tickets when you bet on a horse. You get a ticket to prove that you paid your money and you've got your ticket. He was the one who punched the ticket for you for 20 years. And so, but I don't think anybody thought I was going to wind up being a pari-mutuel clerk. I went to a private school on a scholarship, a full scholarship. I went to Brandeis University on a full scholarship, but it was pretty clear that I was going in the direction as a sophisticated or, from an intellectual background, New York Jewish kid, that I was going to wind up doing something professional. Turns out to have been journalism. When I went to Brandeis, they asked me to write for the paper, the weekly paper there. I started writing for it. I really got a kick out of doing that. I wound up being the editor of the paper. I knew I wanted to do journalism because I'm a very inquisitive guy. And I got a kick out of just mixing it up with the world and learning all kinds of different things. And that's what I've been basically doing. I ducked the draft for 3 years and a graduate school fellowship in the late 60s. And starting in 1970, I was in journalism in the alternative press, weekly press in Boston, which was also left wing. Then I was the editor of a paper. I wrote for the paper. And then I spent a year on a journalism fellowship at the Harvard Business School, learned about business, thought, "Well, this is something this is a very rich area for me to report on and explain." And I've been a PBS locally for years, and then since 1985 nationally, a business reporter, basically. And the reason I tell intimate stories or have people who are telling their own intimate stories is because that's what's effective on television. I mean, Andy mentioned this series I did for the McGraw-Hill Company, where I'm explaining, supply, demand, that kind of thing with using gimmicks and stuff. But, and that stuff is, I think, reasonably effective and still being used years after it was made. But what TV can really do for you, and those of you who are in the class who've seen that story about one of the stories that Bob showed or asked you to watch, about the family that moves from Yonkers to Ossining, that's what you remember. That's what TV is good for doing. And then off and around that, I try to drape or inject insights about issues like the one we're discussing now, which is social mobility, but name any other, from protectionism to the national debt.
Great. So I'm going to get into, you mentioned the role of place and sort of moving from one neighborhood to the other, and obviously education being central to your own sort of journey, and things like scholarships and fellowships and things along those lines. But I want to start with sort of maybe a more macro question, which is, with all your reporting and sort of where we are in this present moment, what would you say about the state of the American dream today and social mobility? Where are we now versus maybe where we've been in previous generations? Or, if you're a kid right now who's growing up and you maybe are not from, a high income bracket, and you're trying to sort of make it, like, what's the state of where we are today?
Well, I think it's obviously where we have been recently, and that the piece that I was talking about, moving from Ossining to moving from Yonkers to Ossining, that was the point of the piece. Just how hard it is. I mean, and it's harder than ever. I mean, we're in an era. My entire reportorial career really begins, like my business reportorial career or economics career begins in the late 70s. And that's about the point at which an entirely new ethos, and not that it was never there, but that the ethos of every man or woman for him or herself begins to predominate. And there are a whole bunch of reasons for that. We could talk about that if you want, but it is demonstrably the case that economically, the difference between most people and those who are doing well grows and grows and grows. The economic inequality grows and grows and grows, and social mobility hasn't moved basically data at all, and if anything has gone in the other direction. So when there's an ethos of every person for him or herself, then the programs that predominated in America starting around 1900, but really flowering in the 1930s during the administration of this guy here, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who comes in 1933. And there he is, the man of the hour. The hour, you see, and he's it's the ship of state that he's at the helm of. From that time on, you've got an ethos in this country that is more and more sharing. I think of left wing versus right wing as basically, are you in favor of sharing or are you not? That's where it comes from, the French National Assembly, the terms the left and right, although of course in French gauche and droit. But it's where they were sitting on the National Assembly in 1789, I think, and I think that's still true. How much are you in favor of sharing on the left, and on the right? No. the way everybody, the way the economy grows is by just encouraging the most enterprising people to take as much as they can, and then it will, as famously during the Reagan administration, the phrase was, it will trickle down. The money will trickle down to everybody else. And,
So,
and we've been
yeah.
living in that environment, and that environment is not an environment that prizes or respects social mobility, because why should you? I mean, just everybody out there, and may the best man win.
So I want to break that down a little bit, because some of your recent reporting on a piece that you did with Bob Putnam on his new book, The Upswing, which looks at that question, right?
Yes, right.
It hasn't always been that way. It's sort of been an ebb and flow. And, we had this sort of period in our history where, going back to the Gilded Age, where there was, me, and sort of a lot of inequality. And then there was a course correction with FDR post the Depression.
Well, see, it starts, and as you know, in the book, The Upswing, the beginning of that period is the progressive movement that around the turn of the century, around 1900, and then it grows and grows. Then you have FDR, and you have the New Deal and so forth, all the way through, though, to Lyndon Johnson and the war on poverty and Medicare, all of that happening during that period, and then we have the reversal.
Yeah. So within that sort of that historical arc, I want to pull out a couple pieces, right? So one is I guess we'll touch on three things. One is the role of policy, which I'll ask about first, and then we'll get into social capital and our own sort of political divisions. With policy, what struck me is that, at least in sort of hearing that story, it was this notion of big ideas and the role of government, right? So it was the New Deal, and it was the Great Society, and these big ideas. And recent sort of reporting from you and others, while obviously there's the Green New Deal, more realistic sort of projections are things like, oh, look, gig workers now get unemployment insurance. sort of smaller policy prescriptions for trying to sort of fix or plug gaps. And I don't know.
Or buy off
the
people who'd otherwise raise a ruckus, right?
Right. So I guess my question is and I remember I had read something years ago about this, that there was a time where private was considered bad for society and public was considered good. And now it's sort of reversed a little bit, right? And the role of government is something that we're much more skeptical of in terms of its role. Are there policy things out there? First of all, could you comment a little bit about how that has changed over time? And are there things to give you a sense of optimism for the role of government in enhancing social mobility these days? Or do we have to sort of just try to pick one thing off at a time?
Elect the 2 senators in Georgia. I mean, seriously, right? I mean, we have just elected a Democratic president who is committed, historically and rhetorically, and with pressure from those around him and in his party, committed to moving in the direction that you're talking about, Bob. That is, putting into place policies that are not band-aids or, token gestures like, oh, now, gig workers have get money from the CARES Act. But are substantial changes. A Green New Deal would be one way of doing it. But, they're talking about, Biden campaign has talked about subsidizing or encouraging care workers, that's childcare, that's elder care, a whole bunch of policies. And it really is a mindset, right? That's the direction we go. And the Democrats have the House, but if they don't get these 2 senators from Georgia, then the Senate can stymie basically any legislation. And then you have, famously gridlock, but you also don't have any kind of the sea change you're suggesting.
Right. But so what's interesting is that, and I don't know if this was different in previous eras, but we obviously are in a very divided time, on a lot of different levels, right? When you get 70 million people voting for two different, each for two different candidates, I mean, that's a lot of people who are coming out to say that this is the direction I want to move in. And the argument could be made that there is some of that is driven by just the role they see government playing in helping people move up, the individual agency argument versus the social contract. But to be a little bit more charitable in the thinking, I think there is also this sort of sense that, when you say, I'm going to pull myself up from my bootstraps or I can do it my own, there is this sort of sense of, well, I'm still doing it in the context of my family or my community. And that there is this sort of sense of place that, and it's just a sort of a smaller sort of things that are helping you move up, things that are closer and more tangible to you than maybe the role of a government program where most people don't even, aren't aware of the kinds of things that may be helping them one way or another.
Oh,
And
that's
so,
absolutely not. That there, I did a story about something that some friend of mine calls the red state paradox, which is the people who rely most on government are most resentful of government. I set this story in Louisiana. So yeah, there is a definite disconnect between what and the image of government or the demonization of government, as it's been going on now for, well, since the 70s and 80s, and even Bill Clinton, where government is supposed to be shrinking because government is somehow too messing with you.
Yeah.
Look at this, goes back to the beginning of who came to America if it wasn't lots and lots of people from lots and lots of places who said government is oppressing me.
Yeah. So let me take that up for a second, because it's interesting to me that if people aren't aware in the ways in which government or other things help them advance in life, it begs the question of, not putting you personally on the spot, but just the way in which we
put me on the spot. I don't care.
the way
Really?
we tell stories, or the way in which this narrative is shaped. How much of the time are we talking about the problem, and how much are we talking about the solution? So obviously, in the last several years, there's been a lot of, understandable and just coverage on income inequality, or just the difference, who has and who doesn't have, and considerably less coverage on, well, what does it take to get ahead? What are the things that drive people up? Much of your reporting, being the exception on that. But I wonder, to the extent to which the way in which we tell our stories, the whole adage of, if it bleeds, it leads, or we tell a story about conflict, that sort of creates some of the division we're talking about, in terms, rather than sort of a shared narrative about the role of education in helping people move up, the role of public universities, how certain government programs do help, or, in some cases, maybe not as much as they were intended. So I'm wondering if you could just sort of speak to the role in which you even see coverage shaped, and whether you even feel pressure about reporting on problems versus solutions.
Of course. No, look, everybody here, I mean, I can't, do I have the gallery view here now? I don't, I guess, oh, wait a second. Let me just see. Yes, please, those of you who haven't put your faces on, please do, just so I can sort of see who you are. But there are a number of photos, but if you could just do the video, it would be great. But and the reason is because I'm speaking to you specifically, and I'm looking at the gallery screen now, so I'm not looking up at the camera. Put yourself, imagine you have my job, and you're trying to read, the NewsHour, maybe 1.5 million people a night. Remember, we got 330 million Americans, 240 million maybe grown-ups who would possibly be watching the NewsHour, somewhere around that. And so it's this tiny, even somebody like me who has this, unbelievably privileged rostrum, I've got this tiny people, and all have clickers, and they can all click to something else. So I've got to be constantly thinking, Bob, about how do I get them in the tent? How do I keep them from clicking, right? And policy stories are like numbers, as is the case with numbers, are just deadly on TV. They're hard to explain. There's back and forth. What are you going to show? You'll just talk to experts, right? And then one expert will tell you one thing, and then we're an even-handed show, the NewsHour. We're religiously even-handed. So then you have to have another person on the other side telling you what's wrong with the policy. And the viewer goes, oh, God, now what do I do? We used to often joke about me and my producer joke about the fact that the person whom we let have the last word would be the person who won the debate, because that's what people remember, So then are you being fair to them? Are you being too tendentious, too one-sided? And so absolutely, in the way we communicate and the means we have of communicating in this world, in this, given the technology and so forth, there's a serious bias in favor of, not at the NewsHour, but if it leads, it bleeds. The NewsHour, oh no, we wouldn't do anything like that. We never covered the O.J. Simpson trial. But if, as I said before, if we have a story where people are wearing their heart on their sleeve as they tell you about moving from the depredations or the dysfunction of Yonkers to the more inviting atmosphere or encouraging atmosphere of Ossining, which is no, high socioeconomic status town, but that we want what works in terms of keeping you watching is the personal story.
Right.
And there's no question that gets in the way of policy stories that, which themselves are it's very hard. I mean, I'll make an additional point, which is it's very hard to find an embodiment of a policy that actually is telegenic and works.
Yeah. Well, so to play devil's advocate for a second, one of the things that was interesting to me is a couple of years ago, I was going through the month of November, and I took it to myself to, I just wanted to sort of thank someone each day who may have played a role in my life, right? People I knew or didn't know. And at one point, I knew that I had been the recipient of Pell Grants, but I had no idea about the history or the story behind them. Mm-hmm. And so I did a little bit of research, and I learned that they were the brainchild, or they were championed by a congressman by the name of Claiborne Pell.
Yes.
Very interesting character, by the way.
He was a senator.
Yes, sorry. Very interesting character. He used to go jogging in suits that he would cut up to make for jogging apparel. So it was a really interesting sort of visual. And I posted a picture of him and thanked him. He'd long obviously passed. But what was interesting to me is that by putting the name of a person to a public policy, the outpouring of people who were like, thank you, Mr. Pell. Oh, without you, I wouldn't have gone to college, was actually a way of humanizing a policy that sometimes can seem very wonkish. And, wonder if there are more opportunities for us to sort of say, like, here's the story behind this. Here's how it came to be. Here's why it's important. Here's who it's helping, as a means by which you can generate more understanding and potentially even support for programs that are often very stigmatizing.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. And it's not a thought I've had before. I don't, there are very, very few policies that are named after a person in the way when you're saying it, I'm thinking of Smoot-Hawley Protectionist Act. You don't want to. Smoot-Hawley? I mean, I actually know who they were, but or the Taft-Hartley anti-union, famous anti-union legislation. So it's an interesting hook. I don't know how often one could use it, and really, the other thing I'm thinking of when I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, well, okay, Medicare or Medicaid. They don't obviously have a name associated with it, but it's Lyndon Johnson. It's during that period, where they came from. But that's not a story that's going to particularly fly. I'm just being, you're playing devil's advocate. I'm just being an honest
I understand.
The question. But the people who run the show, and the audience. I mean, you all can tell me I'm wrong. I mean, those of you who watch the news hour, but that, how much history are we going to do in my stories, let's say, run on average 8 minutes, which is an eternity for commercial, for broadcast or national television news. But how much time am I going to devote to the history? It's going to come down to, what's happening now. Is there any chance that Medicare is going to be cut back? If you asked me to do a story about Medicare right now that would get on the air, it would be, all right, is Biden going to expand Medicare? He says he is, actually, right? Or that's part of what is on the table. Well, the Senate, then there's some little sideline about how the Senate won't go for it, or maybe there are a couple of Republican senators who might go for it. I don't know. But then it's a political story, and it's not going to get at the essence and texture of that great introduction of you that Andy gave. About. I mean, I never heard any introduction of a person before like that, and I was thinking as I was hearing it, yeah, well, I mean, maybe I'll incorporate that, or try to incorporate that, since I was a scholarship student, all the way through. But that in itself is very touching and moving and makes you think. But I don't know. I'm a pretty quick study. So if I had a good idea as to how to turn that into a TV story, I think I could come up with at least a clever response, and I can't.
Yeah. So let me pivot a little bit and ask you another question about how we tell our stories, which is that, when we do focus on problems sometimes, whether it's a problem of a neighborhood or a certain community or challenge that people are dealing with, it can sometimes fall into what some people would sort of characterize as sort of deficit framing, and unintentionally reinforce stereotypes about people who, quote unquote, need help, or people who deserve help. And so, I've received questions, and even in conversations with my students, it's really interesting to me at how pervasive that narrative can be, that there are people who are just looking for help, who don't have any individual agency, who, are, going back to the whole welfare queen, narrative from the Reagan era and things along those lines. So there is this sort of challenge of trying to communicate the need of a community without doing so in a way that suggests they have no agency, if that makes sense. And I'm wondering, how you think the whole way in which we as a society, or at least some people, different parts of the aisle, although I think it may be more pervasive than we think, sort of consider people who need help or who are expressing challenges in their lives that may be, either assistance from the public or, the role of government or others. They just, there's a rung in the ladder that they need some help getting up on. And sometimes we can see as if the only way to do it is to take the step on your own.
And the question is?
The question is, what is the role that we play in the way we tell our stories that actually reinforce the negative stereotypes that suggest people don't have agency and are just looking for handouts?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that question. That would be more a critique, I think. And I have thoughts in response to what you're saying, but I'm not sure that they're pertinent.
Well, let me give you an example from a report.
Yeah, I mean,
so what was interesting to me was that when I looked at one of the pieces you had done, which looked at families who had grown up together in Ohio several, like a generation ago, right? And one of the things they commented on, both, and you can see even in looking at it, is they said at the time in which we were growing up, you couldn't tell who had money or who didn't. We didn't talk about it. You couldn't tell now, even though they had different life outcomes. And there was this sort of way in which maybe they lived their lives and their stories were told that was more about things that had in common, less about class, less about who has and who hasn't. Right. And so maybe they could see themselves as equals, and so would others. Yes. And here we tell the stories in different ways, right? We tell stories about people from different classes as if one has everything and one has nothing. Instead of appreciating that, regardless of class, you obviously can have a very strong family and you can have ambition and you can have agency. And so there's just a way in which I think we tell our stories that sometimes can reinforce stereotypes that can get picked up politically.
I guess that's true. I don't know how you would tell, how I would tell a story about, well, let me start the sentence again. These are not things I've thought of, so I don't have a glib or even coherent response to them. I certainly don't have anything that I can draw on some answer I've given in the past. When you're doing what I or any journalist does in anything approaching a long form, other than, there was a fire on the corner and here's what happened. There are so many factors that go, so many decisions, you could call them micro-moral decisions or something, about, are you stereotyping someone? Are you recently we're doing a story about prisons, and there's a grant to the NewsHour to do stories about people coming out of prison. And I said to the producer, look, to a couple of friends of mine who do prison work, and I am looking for people. I should let everybody know that we are looking, so you could contact me for interesting stories about people who are formerly incarcerated and doing something with regard to the workforce that is compelling, interesting, and whatever. I said, but I don't want it to be African Americans just, or predominantly African Americans, because that would be reinforcing a stereotype in my mind. So are we excluding African Americans, or I prefer the term ADOS now, but American descendants of slavery. But how do we sort of weigh that? And I'm only using that as an example because it's very recent. It's immediate, in fact, but because I hope it gives some sense of what the kinds of things you're thinking about when you're picking people as exemplars or examples, not exemplars, of examples of the story you're trying to tell. I mean, there are a whole bunch of things you weigh in. How articulate are they? Can you understand their accent? There's a brilliant ADOS economist who's deaf, and who when he talks, he knows how to talk. He talks, and if you listen to him, you understand him, have come to understand him, but it takes some adjusting. Do you caption him to make sure that everybody can understand him? The bosses say, look, we can't use him because too many people will not understand him, but he'll be insulted. I know, because I asked him if he's captioned. I mean, there are all these, that's what I call, I don't know if moral's the right word, but micro decisions with regard to not offending, to being respectful of everyone you talk to, of not categorizing, of not stereotyping, of not playing into, and that gets to your question, not playing into the stereotypes that are out there, without bending over backwards so much that the audience says, oh, wait a second, they're just, he's doing that so that we don't think he's stereotyping. All that stuff is going on. That's all I'm trying to say. It's a very complex process.
Yeah, I think also what you speak to is there's a tricky balance sometimes with the fact that there are issues and problems that disproportionately impact certain groups, but that in total, for example, like, there are significantly more poor white people in this country than
Yes.
other, but there are disproportionately more people based on sort of the amount of the population. So it becomes tricky. And then, but if you only sort of show people who are disproportionately impacted, then it creates the wrong sort of impression for everybody, thinking that, certain groups of or certain communities are entirely poor, or are always poor, or are without agency, and that's just factually inaccurate.
Yeah, no, look, we're always thinking. I'm always thinking about that. I'm thinking about that in every story I ever do, and in every, peopling of every story, whether it's gender, whether it's race or ethnicity, whether it's age. Always trying to not fall into that trap.
There's been a lot of research. You've reported on it. Raj Chetty's research, which you have referenced before, the story about Yonkers and Ossining. This notion of the role of place.
People in Yonkers, by the way, were really pissed off at that story.
I got some. Yeah, and I'm going to get,
because they said, wait a second, this isn't. There's rich parts of Yonkers.
Yeah, and that's, I think, and it goes to what we were sort of saying before, in that, like, it's also, and I've spoken to Raj and his team about that research. It's also, what a lot of this is not about your reporting, it's about sort of the way in which people interpret that in general, which is that if you happen to, grow up or live in an area where statistically they show that social mobility is more difficult, then the solution is often perceived to be, well, then move to a different neighborhood. But often people may not want to move. They've got family and friends, and there's a social fabric there that's important to them, or they want that neighborhood improved. They want better schools. They want things to be done where they live, not sort of being told that their only solution is to leave. And I think that's, something that unfortunately is a takeaway of research that I don't think was intended in that way.
Yeah, look, Andy mentioned I started about a year and a half ago with one of my former Yale students, a guy named David McCullough. His grandfather is a famous historian. He's also David McCullough. He's David McCullough III. And we started an organization which is now up and running, which is called the American Exchange Project. I would encourage all of you to look at it. It's AmericanExchangeProject.org. American Exchange Project, one word, and we have a website up. And we've got about 100 kids now, high school students, who meet online, and eventually, when COVID is over, we'll actually visit each other. So it's a domestic foreign exchange program, American Exchange Project, right? And the idea is to make friends, nonpartisan, it's a nonprofit, obviously, across the divides. So we have schools in Kilgore, Texas, in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and in Lexington, Massachusetts, and Concord, and people from totally different economic backgrounds making friends. And they're on chat lines, and we do all kinds of games and things that, and political issues come up, but the point is you find out what fellow Americans are like from completely different places, and eventually, and this is the appeal of the project, you visit. You get to go to Fenway Park if you're a kid from Louisiana, and if you're a kid from Boston, you get to go on an alligator hunt in Louisiana, to use the two extremes. One issue that comes up, a central problem of this project is, do you wind up picking the kids from Lake Charles, Louisiana, who then see this because they're the more enterprising kids who are more interested in what's going on in Lexington, Massachusetts, or wherever. And do they then are we then cherry picking those kids who will then come and live in Lexington, Massachusetts? And there will be a brain drain from, Lake Charles, Louisiana, or brain is probably the wrong way to put it, but that's a standard cliched way of putting it. The more enterprising people or more open-minded people will leave, and then what does Lake Charles do? So this is an issue that we we're confronting on a daily, weekly anyway basis, because
it's interesting that so the project sounds wonderful and fascinating. It also seems like it's in some ways making up for some of the things that may have naturally occurred in society. And one example, again pulling from college, is that at least when I went to college, you signed up and you got a roommate, and whoever that roommate was, you were going to learn about who they were and where they were from.
Mine was from Florida.
Yeah, and now you have a different experience where you can essentially select your roommate based off shared interests and things like that. And so, this opportunity to sort of continue to reinforce the experiences that we have versus seek new ones is interesting. And I would also wonder if you have any sort of thoughts about even how and where we get information today, right? So,
of course. No, absolutely.
And I was recently had a conversation with my class over, post-election, which conversations with my students are always really, I think I learn more than they do. But one of the things that was really interesting to me was that it was very apparent that the information that they were getting was largely probably online through different sources, that the reputational sort of knowledge of what we would traditionally call reputable news sources was undervalued relative to maybe previous generations. And it really sort of spoke to a challenge in terms of media literacy and questioning your sources. Where's the story coming from? Why is the story being reported like this? And I know that you've gone around and you've lectured at various colleges, including Yale and others. And I'm wondering, what do you say to students, when they're both at the same time struggling with their own sort of lives and trying to figure out where they want to go with it, up the ladder, maintain their privilege, whatever it is, and also trying to evaluate all the information as being sort of, that's out there, and in some cases being curated to them in ways they may or may not even be aware of.
I don't, what do I say to them? Watch the PBS NewsHour.
Sorry,
I mean, seriously.
I understand that. I realized that I just gave you a complete layup too. So.
And I don't mean it opportunistically. I mean, that's literally the best, read the New York Times. But the reason we're doing this project is because that's not where it's going to start, because people aren't going to watch the PBS NewsHour any more than they currently are doing. And they're not going to read the New York Times if they have been told at home, told by Fox News, whatever, that's fake news. I've had people, sophisticated people, tell me that the New York Times is fake news. I mean, New York Times may, certainly have had a bias with respect to the last election, although but of course would be my response. But if you were at the PBS NewsHour or at the New York Times or the Washington Post or any of these, or at the Wall Street Journal, and you make something up, you're fired. I mean, you're ostracized. Your career's over.
It's interesting. I had just had that conversation with someone the other day about the difference in terms of standards, and again, maybe that's a level of nuance that's hard to sort of to communicate. But maybe a piece of that is, and it's interesting because obviously it's public television, right? So it is intended for the greater public good,
right? And
as someone, and as someone who benefited from things like Sesame Street, that made sure that when I went to kindergarten, I wasn't behind in sort of language skills. I definitely appreciate the role of it, but perhaps over the course of time, whether it's PBS or the New York Times or other outlets, the association with elitism or sort of speaking above people or not being accessible, even the how do I say this? The inclusion of terms like someone just asked a question about the American descendants of slaves. Is that helpful? Or the language that we use sometimes when we're trying to be on the right side of things, or you have this whole debate going on around political correctness and language and what we say and how we refer to each other, and whether that again isn't stuff that maybe it's needed and necessary to reconcile with our past and be more honest with our language, but at the same time, it could exacerbate existing divides just by the nature
Well,
of how we're talking,
I'm using that language here.
Yeah.
I would not use ADOS in Lake Charles for exactly the reason you
Yeah.
said.
Right.
I mean, you have to know who you I certainly have a sense of it. I mean, people who would be taking your course, for example, or people who are teaching at City University. Uh, so of course your language changes. You say y'all in the South. You don't. I'm not going to say y'all here. I mean,
Right.
I never use that phrase. And I'm very careful about my language when I'm there. For example, I did it here at one moment when I defined what tendentious meant. Right, I said tendentious, and then I thought, well, wait a second, that's one of those fancy ass words, and I should explain what it is. But I'm talking to a college professor, and so that's I'm doing this
Sure.
automatically.
Yep.
And that's what happens. But yes, of course you're careful, and you're touching on, in my view, an essential part of what's happened, certainly in this country, and what's happened in the world, which is this divide, this status divide between those of us who are highly educated and have done amazingly well. I mean, I don't, even I've done, by my standards, amazingly well, and I'm just a public television reporter, but as opposed to people who really have to, the cab drivers of my past. I mean, I got out of graduate school and I needed a job, and so I was a cab driver for three and a half months. That's my cab driving past, and I full-time job and so forth. But those guys, I mean, I was a pup, and then they're probably all passed away by now, but those guys were on a totally different track than I was going to be on, right? And in fact, cab drivers aren't making any more today. I know, because I've talked to enough of them, than I was making back then. If inflation adjusted, they're making slightly less, whereas the economy has grown, I don't know, fourfold or something like that since, and therefore you should be making, I don't know, twice as much money, let's say. And certainly somebody like me is, compared to those days. So yes, this status divide is hugely problematic, because, and let me go on about this for just a moment, Bob. But what's so problematic about it, and I think it's what you're touching on, is even if I say ADOS, okay, again, let's just say I said it in Lake Charles, Louisiana, it would have the connotation. It would have the sense of, I'm a politically correct, highly educated person. It's reminding you in Louisiana that you enslaved people, or that's at least how you might well take it, right? And if I use the word tendentious similarly, not the same thing, but it would be, hey, look at me, look look how much education you'd have to use the word tendentious and know what it means. I just pick that because I happen to use it. But so and what that has done, that status divide, which goes with economic divide as well, is that the people who are on the downside of that feel they're being talked down to and are disrespected, right? And that's, I mean, just think about any of you. I mean, what's the worst thing that can happen to you? Is it somebody disses you, somebody disrespects you, somebody thinks you're lesser than they are, thinks you don't know what you're talking about, thinks you're an idiot, which is, and that is a huge problem. And it's one of the reasons I worry about cherry picking in the American Exchange Project, that what it's vulnerable to is pulling people out of those environments, learning them, teaching them all to say tendentious and ADOS, and then they're no longer part of those communities, and those communities are more entrenched and more resentful because the guy who left and went to Yale from our community is now too too big for his britches.
Right. Yeah, so it's interesting because, on a personal level, that's a challenge that I deal with, right? So I did move, I moved from a place, that, continues to have a lot more economic challenges, and I've been able to sort of, move up the economic ladder, and having those conversations is really challenging. But what I do find is that I still hold tremendous respect for the status of people who are, whether in my family or others, because I know what they do for a living are things that I actually couldn't do, right? So we do sort of assume certain status levels based on occupation and class, in ways in which maybe, are often sort of overstated, right? You see things, for example, people from, lower socioeconomic levels are generally more charitable in their giving as a percentage of income.
Yes.
They have more social capital in many cases by their,
Yes.
ways in which they organize.
I've done studies
A lot of these traits that we sometimes don't, quite, talk about quite as much. When we think economics, sometimes we think about it in sort of a macro sense. We talk about systems. We talk about capitalism, as this engine of social mobility. And I'm wondering if you could sort of speak to, and conversely, by the way, to say the word socialism or to talk about sort of social constructs in this country is a non-starter for many in terms of just turning people off to an oversized role of government. So, given that capitalism is the system that we work in, I'm wondering what you would sort of say in terms of what it's getting right and what it's getting wrong, and how we should sort of think about that in the context of, because it seems like we either think about it as, oh, it's this engine that allows us, if you work hard to move up, or other people think about it as systems completely corrupt and broken. And I'm assuming the answer is somewhere in the middle. I
have a friend from high school who was a member of the Communist Party when he went to Harvard, who thinks that America and is now very conservative. I don't think he's a Trump conservative, but he's certainly a very conservative guy politically. And he and I had a discussion once, just years ago, but where he said America is socialist. That is because of the New Deal and Medicare and Medicaid and so forth. The percentage of the economy that it goes through government now, while it's not nowhere near what it is in Denmark, let's say, where there's free healthcare and free universities and so forth. But it's way, way, way more than it was at the turn of the 20th century, the Gilded Age, as you called it, the 1890s, let's say. Where government was nothing. There was no income tax. Government was tiny as a percentage of the economy as a whole. And now it's 30%, 40%, if you cast out state and local governments, higher than that. And so we are socialist. That is socialism being, according to him, socialism being defined as, how much redistribution is there? How much does the state get involved in the economy, which is the fair definition of it, I think. So we are not what we were in 1900 in terms of every man and woman for themselves. But this gets, I think, more technical than perhaps we have time for. But in this period from the late 70s on, the way the mantra of capitalism in this country and elsewhere in the developed world has been max shareholder value. That is, the company's job is not to worry about the so-called stakeholders, which would be the customers, the suppliers, the community, all the social groups that the company affects, but just the people who technically own the stock of the company. And so the company's job is to maximize the value of the company for the shareholders, because without going into much detail, if you own a share in a company, basically what you own is a share in the profits, or you have a claim on the profits of the company. So the company should be as profitable as it can, not worry about anything else. And that, it seems to me, has gone so far overboard as a definition of capitalism, or how capitalism has been progressing, that even though we became much more socialist than we were 120 years ago, we have swung back in the direction of, well, lower safety net. If you adjust for inflation, minimum wage is much lower than it was than it would be if you adjusted for inflation. For example, the federal minimum wage. But that we've swung back because of this ethos that I talked about a lot, much earlier, to the free market fundamentalism is something I've called it in the past, and I think that's a huge problem. There's a woman at Harvard Business School. I don't have the book right here somewhere, but a university professor at Harvard. Her name is Rebecca Henderson. She has a book called Reimagining Capitalism, which is her attempt to try to refocus us on corporations which are trying to serve the shareholder, the stakeholders, not just the shareholders, and she sees a movement back in that direction, and let's hope it sticks.
So, it's interesting, Paul, as you were going through that, it made me see a similarity between how you were describing both the role of government and the role of business, in that, there's this notion of sort of, targeted intervention versus universal, right? So do you have something that is intended to benefit everybody? So a lot of, you mentioned Denmark and things like that, a lot of their programs, they're for everyone, right?
Oh yeah.
Versus in the States, obviously Social Security is universal and there's some others, but otherwise it's largely a system predicated on targeted. We're not going to make public university free for everybody, but we'll do scholarships to help some, or we'll allow, we're not doing a lot of universal things, right? And so that in by its very nature divides people in terms of, why are they getting help and I'm not? Why do we, do this for some people?
That's a huge, absolutely.
And then similarly, what you're describing is the same thing that's happening in capitalism, which is we're going to target, specifically the shareholder as being, primacy, versus universally, who do we benefit? The worker, the consumer, and stuff like that. So I wonder if by the nature in which we sort of choose, how we look at the beneficiaries of our various systems, government or business, that it inherently creates division.
And the question is?
Well, it's not a question. I'm just putting a theory out there that I hadn't really sort of put together before.
Yeah, no, I don't think that. I'd have to think about it. I don't know the extent to which that parallel is makes a big difference. I just don't know.
So one of the most
we want to ask some people to come in, because we're.
Yeah, they're posting their questions now.
But are you asking those questions?
Yeah, I've been taking them and paraphrasing them.
Oh, okay, great. I see them popping up, but
Yep. So, interestingly, when I had asked actually students to submit questions in advance, and I've been paraphrasing some of those along the way, it was interesting to me that they fell into these two sort of categories. I mean, there were obviously more nuanced questions in there, but largely it was about, what can we do to create more social mobility, right? How do we create a better ladder? And also, how do we overcome our divisions? And they're linked, right? But I'm wondering if there's anything out there, as we're sort of coming up on time, that gives you sort of a sense of optimism, or things that if you could wave a magic wand, you're like, I'd like to see these 3 or 4 things happen that I think would be, highly beneficial to the country at large.
Well, I could probably list, I think lots of things in the Biden program are probably useful. And as I say, it'll depend upon the Senate and, Mitch McConnell's health or something like that. But what gives me optimism, to the extent I have optimism, is the American Exchange Project because that I'm connected to, and I've been to Lake Charles, and I've been there several times, and I'm in contact with the Baptist minister from Kilgore, and the one thing I can tell you categorically is that the receptivity to the idea of making friends across the divide is enormous. In fact, it's that boys in our group, for sort of obvious reasons. No Boogaloo boys. So it's not universal in that sense. It isn't that every single person in America wants to meet people from a different background and get to know them and make friends with them. But those people are not in high school anyway, either because they dropped out or because they're older. We were welcomed with open arms in Lake Charles, Kilgore, Cotulla, Texas, Longview, and everywhere we've gone. A little hard to recruit students to be regular participants, although once they've gone through one of these hangouts, they come back again and again and become part of this group. And our notion is that this is like a national boys and girls club kind of thing, where there are American Exchange Project clubs in schools throughout the country. And from our point of view, this is a long game, so 20 years or whatever, we hope to have this be something that almost any high school kid could participate in. And that gives me hope, because I do think that when you're still in high school, and I think it because I see it, you're open to questioning your political, your moral identity in ways that you're not when you get older.
Yeah, I assume, Paul, that would also be something, as the questions came in, that you would see could also extend, if not your program, at least in principle, into college, right? Or into whatever. And it's also just a general sort of ethos that we could all bring to our lives, like to seek out people who are different from us.
Yeah, absolutely. But look, yeah, we're just trying to facilitate it. But
it also, it's interesting because it is, sometimes we think about sort of mobility as something sort of that is sort of very big and happens with the wave of a policy wand, versus something where we each play a role in our daily lives in the many hats we wear. If you're a business person, you have a role in terms of the policies you put in place. If you're a professor, you're playing a role in terms of how you're talking to students and understanding the fullness of their lived experience. Right. If you are, in philanthropy, there's an opportunity for you to understand the role of giving, and also appreciating that people are not just sort of a deficit or a problem that you're looking to fix, but that there is, fullness of that person's experience that maybe you can, really hold up as exemplar in ways that we assign status to others as well. We're running up on time. I'm going to turn it over to Andy in a second, but I did want to ask you one last question, which was, you had mentioned the program that you're doing now, the American Exchange Program. And
American Exchange Project.
Sorry, American Exchange Project. Sorry about that. And that it is this idea of just connecting people who are different, and that can be something that could be a seminal experience for someone. And I'm wondering if there are people who were seminal in your life who have helped you get to where you are today. And you can say these names and no one listening right now will probably know who they are, but I always think there's such richness in hearing the names spoken out loud and giving the opportunity to people to say thanks to someone. And so I wondered if you wanted to say a quick shout out to anybody who along the way, if it weren't for them coming into your life, you wouldn't, be on this call with us right now.
Well, I'd start, Clara Anton, my 6th grade teacher, Adele Littauer. We called our teachers by their first names because it was a progressive school. Adele Littauer in 7th, when I was 7, in the 7s, we also didn't use grades, we used 7s. Mimi Stern was in the 8s, Mabel Hawkins in particular in the 9s. She was fantastic. Charity Bailey, my music teacher from that era, Lou Sarlin, in the 11s, Murray Lewis, my 8th grade teacher. I think we went to grades by then. Joji Konoshima, my 9th grade homeroom teacher. Ed Suvanto, who was the English teacher in the 10th grade and 11th grade. A few of my college teachers, I would say, Kurt Wolf, sociologist. I think that, I mean, and then, lots of my parents' friends that, I could go on, and I unfortunately have a very good memory for names. So it would take us forever. But yeah, I mean, you can't, I'm a smart guy and stuff, but I'm unbelievably lucky person to have been in the environment I've been in and mixed with the people I've been taught by, the people I've been taught by, and stuff like that. I have no illusions about bootstrapping, not in my case, and I haven't had really a tough road to hoe. So yeah, I'm a person who's grateful, literally, explicitly. I don't write it down like they tell you to. The 3 things to be grateful. Every day, I'm grateful for my grandchildren, my kids, my friends. Grateful for this, frankly. I mean, you said in the beginning that Andy said that Christine Lee, who's here, said, "Would you be interested?" No, I said to Christine and her sister, whom I taught with at Gateway Community College, we co-taught there. I said, please have me come and share whatever I can, and that's how this came to be. And so I'm literally grateful that you invited me.
Well, as are we. And so thank you so much, Paul. I'm going to turn it over to Andy to wrap us up and take us out.
Well, great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Bob. Bob, thank you for a creative and interesting set of questions, and Paul for engaging them in such a direct and thoughtful way. It was really one of, I think, our best conversations this semester, and I'm grateful to both of you for it. I guess just a couple of last thoughts. I mean, and really more directed at our students, which is, I feel like one thing, if there is a takeaway from this conversation, and there are many, one important one is that the project of social mobility in the United States has been going in the wrong direction in many respects for a couple of generations. I think it's a project, though, that goes in the right direction at City College. And I guess 2 messages to our students on that front is, one, it doesn't just happen at City College. It happens because of the work all of you put in and how that combines with what the institution does. And how you do that in a way that is intentional and thoughtful about how you perceive yourself and how you perceive the opportunities for yourself and your peers and classmates. So I encourage you to not take it for granted that City College will do this for you. We are equipped to do it, but it takes your active engagement and your active involvement. And we're here and excited to be your partners in that project, because when we do that together, it does change things for you, but also for our society. And then I guess the second point I'd make is one that's that came up, it seems to me, repeatedly in the conversation, which is this is an explicitly political project, the larger project of achieving social mobility. And part of why we've been going in the wrong direction is because our politics have been going in such difficult directions, with fits and starts over the last, I would say 45 to 50 years. And that makes it a matter of public policy too. And we're in the midst of a pretty critical moment on that front too, in our politics and where our politics are headed. And so I invite you, as a School of Social Sciences, be engaged with that conversation, which is kind of the more macro conversation as well. And to that end, I cannot end without plugging our next event, which is tomorrow. At 4:30 p.m., we have an event thinking about American democracy in the wake of the elections with Maria Hinojosa, a reporter with NPR, and with Keith Boykin, who is with CNN, to talk about these elections, talk about where they're headed and what their implications in particular are for human rights and for civil rights. So I hope you'll join us then. But again, let me end today by just thanking Paul Solman, Bob McKinnon, very much for an informed and engaging and wonderful conversation. Hope everybody has a good evening, and thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you very much.